This was the final peak. For months now, we've seen non-stop reports linking the Toronto Raptors to a blockbuster trade centered around Domantas Sabonis. We've heard the package it, we've seen the speculation, we've seen the draft pick math break down in 100 different ways, but there was always one major roadblock standing in the way of this deal actually getting done. And that roadblock wasn't Sacramento, it wasn't Toronto's willingness to pay, it wasn't even Sabonis himself, it was Jakob Poeltl. More specifically, it was his contract, his health situation, and the fact that Toronto needed a third team willing to absorb his money without sending salary back. And until now, that team simply didn't exist. But today, everything changed. Earlier today, we saw a very quiet but very intentional update come out through Raptors media. Jakob Poeltl is reportedly doing 2-on-2 work with development coaches, cleared for contact, but still without a firm return date. And if you've followed the Raptors long enough, you already know how this works. These updates don't come out randomly, especially not during trade deadline week. Historically, certain reporters act as a direct pipeline to the front office, and when these kinds of health updates surface, it usually means the team is trying to stabilize or slightly boost a player's trade value. Because the truth is, Poeltl's contract is not an easy one to move. He's owed close to $20 million annually, and he's dealing with recurring back issues. That combination makes teams hesitant, especially contenders. No one wants to take that deal unless there's real compensation attached. And that's exactly why the Sabonis talk stalled. For Toronto to land Sabonis, they needed to do two things at once. They needed to send real assets to Sacramento, and they needed to move Poeltl somewhere else entirely. The Kings have no interest in taking Poeltl back, so Toronto was forced to find a third team willing to absorb his contract. For weeks, that was the missing link. Then came the Shams bomb. According to Shams Charania, the Memphis Grizzlies completed a massive trade with the Utah Jazz involving multiple rotation players and 3 future first-round picks. But the most important part of that deal wasn't even the players, it was the financial aftermath. That trade created a trade exception for Memphis worth roughly $28.8 million, and that changes everything. With a trade exception that large, Memphis can absorb a contract like Jakob Poeltl's without sending any salary back. They don't need to match money. They don't need to complicate the deal. They can simply take the contract into the exception, and that instantly makes them the perfect third team. Shortly after the trade, reports started circulating that Memphis had emerged as a potential suitor for Jakob Poeltl as Toronto continues to pursue Domantas Sabonis. This wasn't random speculation. This was timing. This was opportunity. This was the market shifting in real time. Memphis, at this point, is clearly signaling a philosophical change. They're willing to take on money, they're willing to absorb contracts, and they're willing to do it in exchange for draft capital. That's exactly what Toronto needed. So now, for the first time, there's a realistic path forward. In a potential multi-team framework, Toronto sends the main package to Sacramento for Sabonis. Memphis absorbs Jakob Poeltl into their trade exception. Toronto sends Memphis a future first-round pick as compensation, and Sacramento never has to touch Poeltl's contract. That's the cleanest version of this deal. And once Memphis is involved, things get even more interesting. Because Memphis doesn't just offer financial flexibility, they also have actual basketball pieces that could be folded into a larger deal. One name that stands out immediately is Santi Aldama. Aldama has quietly been one of the more efficient and versatile bigs in Memphis. He's averaging around 14 points, 7 rebounds, and 3 assists per game, while providing spacing and size. He's young, he fits Toronto's timeline, and he fits their style of play. If Toronto can turn Poeltl's contract into Sabonis and a rotational big like Aldama, that's a massive win in terms of roster balance. This is why Memphis being involved matters so much. But the ripple effects don't stop there. Because once Memphis signals that they're willing to absorb contracts and accumulate picks, people naturally start asking the next question. What about Ja Morant? Ja Morant is still one of the most explosive guards in the league. He's averaging around 19 points and 8 assists this season. And while his efficiency has dipped, the talent is undeniable. But his three-point shooting has been a real issue. He's hovering in the low 20s from deep, and that matters when you're talking about roster construction. There's been some speculation about a scenario where Toronto somehow lands both Sabonis and Ja Morant, sending out Emmanuel Quickley, Poeltl, and multiple draft picks. On paper, that's a star-driven move. In reality, it's complicated. A lineup built around Ja Morant, Domantas Sabonis, Scottie Barnes, and Brandon Ingram would be incredibly talented, but the spacing would be a real concern. None of those players are elite three-point shooters, and stacking them together would make offensive flow difficult. That's why it feels unlikely that Toronto goes all the way in on that kind of move. However, the fact that Memphis now has the flexibility to reshape their roster puts Ja Morant's name firmly back into the conversation league-wide. And here's the key detail. Everything is waiting on Giannis. Multiple teams are monitoring the Giannis situation closely, and the teams that don't land him are going to pivot aggressively. When that happens, Ja Morant becomes the next major domino. That's why this deadline feels so chaotic. You've got the East improving rapidly. You've got teams feeling pressure not to fall behind. You've got noise around James Harden, which has already pushed several franchises stop waiting and start acting. And now you've got Memphis sitting on a massive trade exception that can reshape multiple deals. For Toronto, this is the moment. They didn't change their strategy. Sacramento didn't suddenly get desperate. The market changed. The final obstacle finally became movable. This doesn't guarantee that a Sabonis deal gets done, but for the first time, it means the deal is actually executable. And once that happens, things can move very, very fast. I'll keep tracking every update as it comes in. More soon.